Second Amendment scholar David Kopel on what might come of President Trump's executive order on guns. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of the Reload.com and a CNN contributor. I did that one backwards from how I normally say this. But you can head over to the Reload.com today if you want to check out all of our latest reporting from a sober, serious perspective on gun policy and politics throughout the country. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America, that is the best place to go and do it. This week, we are going to be talking about Donald Trump's firearms executive order that he issued just recently here. And we want to get into some of the details of what this might turn into, some of the policy areas that this might have an impact. And to do that, I have gun policy expert with me this week, David Kopel from Independence Institute, who is joining us once again. Thank you for coming on the show again, David.
Thanks for having me. You're the best firearms show in the known universe.
Thank you. Well, we always appreciate you coming on and giving your insight as a Second Amendment scholar here. Speaking of which, can you tell people a little bit more about your background, just for anyone who doesn't know the full details?
Sure. I'm the research director of the Independence Institute, which is in Denver, Colorado. And I've been in that position since 1992. I started writing for them in 1988. Independence Institute is the second oldest of the state level think tanks. I'm also I'm also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. And I've been writing for them since first published by them in 1988. And I'm also a senior fellow at the University of Wyoming College of Law Firearms Research Center.
Mm-hmm. And your writing has been cited in numerous federal court cases and the Supreme Court.
Seven Supreme Court opinions, including by Justice Thomas in the Bruen decision and over 100 other lower courts.
So you have a very good understanding of federal firearms law and policy. And so I'm hoping that we can go through this executive order, which really, at the moment, all it does is order a review from the Attorney General to go and look at some but it is kind of the top priorities of a lot of the gun rights movement, what they want to see the executive branch do in this administration. But it is at the moment just a review, and it's, it doesn't flesh out a lot of the details. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish here. So it lists out 7 areas that the AG is supposed to focus on. Now, some of these are a bit redundant, right? Like the first one talks about all presidential and agency actions during the Biden administration, essentially, that purport to promote safety, but may have impinged on the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens. So that's kind of a catch-all thing for all the later later subsections. But the first one is rules promulgated by the Department of Justice, including the ATF. So can you just walk us through what you see as the possible, not necessarily exactly what's going to happen, but some of the possibilities from that first section there, the ATF rules that we saw from the Biden administration?
Oh, well, let's see. They lost on their this came from the Trump administration, but then further by the Biden administration was the bump stock rule. And that's obviously been held unlawful by the Supreme Court in Garland v. Cargill. And the Supreme Court didn't rule on the Second Amendment issue, which would not be a winner on that particular topic, but said it just doesn't match what the statute says. There's been a ton of ATF rulemaking by the Biden administration. Most famously, I suppose, the pistol brace rule, which it's long and confusing, but it seems to say that most pistol braces are presumptively unlawful because they convert a gun into a short-barreled rifle, which under the National Firearms Act you can own, but you got to pay a $200 tax and go through a registration procedure. And then there's also a making rule, which is currently being litigated, but that aims to at the least restrict the manufacture of a firearm at home for personal use.
Yeah, the frames and
Particularly
receivers rule.
starting with an 80% receiver.
Right, where they're reclassifying receivers, at least the kits, and they've kind of been a little vague. Maybe
Right.
it's even more than just the kits.
Yeah.
As far as gun making, homemade gun kits. But yeah, so those are the two, I think, biggest ones that people have heard of and that have the biggest impact in real terms, at least in theory. Like the pistol brace ban, there were millions of those guns out there when the Biden administration handed that down. Although all of these have kind of been stuck in court, right? You also have, for instance, the used gun sales rule, where they tried to, make a new rule that implies most people who are selling used guns ought to get a federal license to do so as a dealer.
That's also a troublesome one, because it's always been, and by the way, on the making thing with 80% receivers and all that, that's currently in front of the Supreme Court, and they've had oral argument.
Right.
And I would say, based on that, I'd expect the government to win that case.
It does seem to lean that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, a question on that. I don't know. Maybe this may be outside of both our areas of expertise, but is there something they could even actually do at this stage now that oral arguments are over and we're just waiting on the court to deliver an opinion with the so-called ghost gun rule? Is there anything the Trump administration can actually do?
I think I don't think this is going to happen. But the attorney general could say, we petitioned for certiorari, you granted it, and you did everything. But we'd like to let you now know that we confess error and we were legally wrong. So if you let us withdraw the case, swell, and if not, please rule against us.
Okay, so that's one thing that they could do.
Yes.
And we'll get into later on maybe some of the things you think they might actually do out of this executive order. But I just want to establish, some of the stuff that is realistic to expect from this order as a possibility. And so one is that they could try to, and this maybe hits on two parts of this executive order, because there's another one we'll get into later that deals with, reconsidering their legal positions in court in gun related cases. But so they could try to effectively moot the Supreme Court case or withdraw the DOJ's position and prevent the Supreme Court from issuing an opinion. Yeah,
and to say we're planning on repealing this rule, so there's no case or controversy anymore, because we're going to get rid of the rule. But getting rid of it once you've got a rule that's been published in the Federal Register as a final rule, then you can't just wave your hands and get rid of it. You've got to go through typically the Administrative Procedure Act's process of like, okay, we're going to, just as when you created the rule, when you want to repeal it, you got to publish a proposal, put it out for a 60-day notice and comment period, then revise the rule based on the comments and then take action. And that's a slower process than the Supreme Court, which wraps up its term in late June and always rules on all the cases that it heard oral argument on by then. There are
it takes about a year, right?
That are continued over the next term. But the normal thing is the Supreme Court is going to have a result for us by June 30th.
Yeah, so there's limited time to act for at least the frames and receivers rule.
Right.
Although they could start the process, I suppose, and tell the court.
And even if they say they've started the process, they can say, "Oh, court, don't bother publishing an opinion because, it's going to go away anyway. So we just want to save you some time."
Right. So, bottom line on this first section here, these ATF rules, what they can do is start the rulemaking process over again to withdraw these rules or to change their interpretation away from what the Biden administration had done, and that would fit within what Trump had promised to do on the campaign trail.
I believe he promised to do some of the stuff on day one.
He promised to do it in the first week, but so not timetable wise, but it is what he promised to undo the Biden rules essentially. And, although he was never, specific about which rules. He just kind of said all of them. So we'll see if they go that far. But okay, so that's good to establish there.
You mentioned the sales rule, and I think that's actually one that might have the most practical impact on people. The general rule by congressional statute in the Gun Control Act, as amended by the Firearms Owners Protection Act in 1986 is you need a federal firearms license if you are engaged in the business. And engaged in the business means repetitive activity for profit. So, if you're going to gun shows and flea markets, renting a table there, and over the course of a year, you buy 23 guns and you resell 20 of them over the year for a profit, then you're plainly engaged in the business. And actually, President Obama, in a sort of flurry of executive and regulatory action in January of his final year in 2016, came out with a BATF interpretive guideline on that, which was actually, despite all the uproar, in a partisan sense, it was a perfect explanation of that rule and its correct application. And what it also means is if you have 15 guns and your wife says, we need some money to go on vacation this summer, so why don't you go to the gun show this weekend and sell a few? And the husband does and sells 3 guns. That's not repetitive transactions, and he's not engaged in the business. There might be state laws. There will be state laws that apply to that, but he doesn't need a federal firearms license to do that kind of one-time occasional thing. But what the new Biden rule seems to say is if you ever sell a gun for a nominal profit, then you're supposedly engaged in the business, which is wrong.
Or it could be, yeah. It's sort of vague.
Well, yeah. I mean, let's suppose you bought a revolver in 1977 for $275, which would be a good high quality, fairly high priced revolver at the time. And now you turn around in 2025 and you sell it for $300. Well, thanks to inflation, you're actually selling for a loss. But you've made a nominal profit of $25 Federal Reserve notes, dollars in Federal Reserve notes, as people sometimes call them. And Biden would say you needed to get a federal firearms license for doing that. And that seems obviously wrong, contrary to the statute, and ought to be one of the easiest things for the new administration to go the other way on.
And that was something where the 2022 Bipartisan Safer Communities Act had slightly modified the language.
Yes.
And so they were using that as a justification, even though the language is still pretty similar to the previous statute. But and we've actually seen a couple of Republican senators who voted for that legislation say that this was not their intention. So,
Charlie Brown,
certainly
the football.
Questionable stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they were trying. I understand they were trying to be nice and bipartisan and all that, but then they enacted a statute that was going to be implemented with further regulations by the Biden administration, which does not. And if it had been the Biden administration full of people who were like Joe Biden in 1987, the guy who voted for the Firearms Owners Protection Act, but was also in favor of some gun control, it could have been fine. But the Biden we had was a guy who just turned over all his domestic policy to the extreme left of the Democratic Party, and including the gun ban lobbies.
All right. Well, so I guess bottom line here on this first section of this order is what's possible is that you'll see all these Biden rules undone through the rulemaking process.
Some of them, yes.
We'll get into whether or not they're going to do all of them, but that's the potential, including maybe effectively mooting this Supreme Court decision in Vanderstock before it comes out. So that's the possibility. I'll take a
50-50 bet and a prediction market on that happening.
Right. The next section here deals with what they call the enhanced regulatory enforcement policy at the ATF.
Yeah. And
so this is what people usually refer to as zero tolerance policy towards gun dealers, which has seen the number of license revocations increase quite significantly during the end of the Biden administration, and that the industry has been, very upset with, and claims that, most of these revocations are over minor paperwork violations that don't actually end up with anyone obtaining a gun who shouldn't have it, or, results in any sort of, really bad outcomes. So, I guess that is still in place at the moment. We've heard from NSSF, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, but this order is saying, go and look at this policy, right?
Yes. And I think that my guess is that ought to be one of the easy ones. And, the Trump administration conceives of itself as pro-business. He's been a real estate developer in New York, so he knows about paperwork and business. And this is really just abusive stuff. You should take away the licenses from gun dealers who are, for example, selling guns off the books. But minor paperwork violations, first-time offense, low quantity, things like that, the Biden administration's just been abusive because, again, it was under the control for gun policy, for the most part, of the gun ban lobbies who just hate the existence of gun stores at all and hate gun ownership. As Gabby Giffords said, no more guns, gone. So anything they can do that's anti-gun, even if it doesn't enhance public safety in a realistic sense, if it helps get rid of guns, they did it. And so that certainly ought to be something they fix.
So that's the outcome there, is just they could potentially revoke that zero tolerance policy and go back to, I guess, a more nuanced approach toward enforcement for firearms licensees.
Yeah, and it wasn't like the Barack Obama administration was considered all loose and soft on rogue gun dealers. I mean, all they got to do is just go back to the historic ATF policy that's existed for many decades, including the Obama administration. And on that one, that's easier to do because that's not a formal regulation published in the Federal Register. It's just a policy which a department can change whenever it wants.
Yeah. So that one's, you could get instant action if they decide to do it. Okay. The next one we got here deals with the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention.
Yeah.
And any of the reports and related documents from that. Now, it's still a bit unclear exactly what's going on with that office. It seems the website is no longer up.
Yeah.
There are people who had worked there, and this was sort of a clearinghouse for gun control activists in the White House. It was kind of honestly, it was mostly a symbolic thing to kind of satisfy that constituency for the Biden administration.
I'd say more than symbolic because the federal government is this huge sprawling thing, and it's not like the ATF director and talks to the attorney general that often, let alone talking to the president. So, as Woody Allen said, half of life is just showing up, and having an office in the White House itself or next door in the executive office building is a really important thing for connecting and pushing stuff. Because if the president
that was the idea, coordination.
Right. Well, if the president says, go do something anti-gun, and he gives a speech about it. Well, he's got the speech, but no president, even ones who have all their marbles and are very much on top of things, like, say, Jimmy Carter, who was, known as a micromanager, even they aren't going to be making the phone calls down the bureaucracy to get things done. So when you create a White House office, among other things, you create the follow-up to keep pushing the rest of the federal executive branch in the direction they want.
Yeah, fair point. I just recall when they were when the gun rights, I keep saying the wrong thing here, the gun control groups were advocating for the creation of this office. The argument was over whether it would be, all that effective in implementing policy, and they still wanted it even just for the symbolic purposes. So it may still, I think it's a fair point you're raising there, that the idea was to coordinate across different executive branches with this office, but it seems to be gone. The people who worked there before seem to be under the belief that it's gone. They're no longer working there.
Yeah.
And the website's down. That the administration, for whatever reason, has not confirmed or denied that this office has been closed down. There was some talk about maybe reorganizing it to do something else or just shutting it down. Either way, this executive order talks about looking at the reports and things that the office released. What do you make of that?
Well, and I'm purely speculating here, but it's possible that the White House silence you described so far might reflect thoughts of, do we actually want to keep this thing around and bring our own people into it? So you could actually bring in people who believe in preventing the misuse of guns. Whereas, in fact, it's called the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, but more honestly, it should have been called the White House Office of Gun Prevention. It was staffed by anti-gun nuts and extremists who just often come from organizations that hate gun ownership in general. So you could conceivably have an office that says, no, what we'd actually like to do is reduce victimization by violent gun crime, violent gun criminals. And so we might issue reports talking about how sentencing laws should be changed so that repeat armed robbers serve longer sentences in state prisons. And you might also put out documents with honest data on licensed carry or on what's called constitutional carry and say, well, the data taken as a whole don't seem to show large statistically significant effects on crime, plus or minus, but we have anecdotally huge numbers of people who have been able to defend themselves because they had the right to carry, defend their families, defend other innocent people, stop mass shooters. And so a real White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention might take an advocacy role and criticize laws such as in New York or Hawaii that basically say, well, we'll give you a carry permit, you just can't use it anywhere.
Yeah. Or they could, I suppose they could also just delete everything that the previous office had put out. They've been kind of doing that in a lot of areas of government to this point. So,
it would make me happy if, besides deleting it, they also published a report on the deletion explaining why the statistics were used in a misleading way or didn't look at the full picture, for example.
All right. So there's some of the possibilities that could lead to. Obviously a lot of these things you get one line in this order for each of these things. We don't have a ton to go off. We're just trying to put some meat on the bone, so to speak, here as to what these might look like. All right. So the next thing from there is, and this one could be pretty significant. We kind of mentioned it earlier, but the AG is supposed to review positions taken by the United States in any and all ongoing and potential litigation that affects or could affect the ability of Americans to exercise their Second Amendment rights. So this seems like, and we have seen actually some action on this. I mean, or acknowledgement of this in some of these cases. I think there was a pistol brace ban case. You saw the DOJ lawyers file a request for a stay or for like an extent. They wanted more time to. They wanted to post an oral argument, which is, I believe, scheduled for the first week in March. Yeah, in the Fifth Circuit. Right. So the government's lawyers there, the DOJ has asked the court to let them basically do what this executive order is suggesting and review their position in the case and then decide, before deciding what to do and how to approach oral arguments. Yeah. But so that seems like something they might, I guess they could do across all sorts of gun related cases throughout the entire federal judiciary, right? Well, in theory. In theory, yes. And let's go into this. So first of all, the United States in the lower federal courts rarely files amicus briefs. So if you've got individual plaintiffs suing the state of New York and the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, you're not going to expect the Department of Justice to come in with an amicus brief on either side of that. And
that's longstanding, and it's still that way on gun cases. Then you've got the question of when there's a affirmative lawsuit filed by the NRA or the Second Amendment Foundation or Gun Owners America, Firearms Policy Coalition, groups like that, that challenge a federal law as violating the Second Amendment. And so there's a number of cases right now challenging the ban on 18 to 20-year-olds buying handguns from FFLs. And there's a whole bunch of cases that are direct attacks on the Gun Control Act statute. The norm of state attorneys general and the United States Attorney General from time immemorial, as long as we've had attorneys general, is that the Attorney General in this way operates as the lawyer for the government and defends the statute no matter what. And that's even true if the Attorney General can say, you know what, this might have been okay under the precedents that existed 30 years ago, but the Supreme Court's been going in a different direction. And I think if we defend this law, we're going to lose. The general approach is fine. Go ahead and lose. But just like every felony defendant gets a lawyer who will speak up for him, every statute gets an attorney general who will defend it. And that was, and I'll say to the Biden administration's credit, when there were cases involving PLACA, the 2005 Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which outlaws many of the abusive lawsuits that were going on against firearms manufacturers and stores, Biden hated that bill, fought it in the Senate, and as president campaigned against it, and as president repeatedly and often inaccurately denounced it. But nevertheless, the Department of Justice in court made good arguments that, well, whatever it is policy, it's not unconstitutional. You can argue the constitutionality both ways, but I think the stronger case is it is constitutional. But the point is the Department of Justice did its job and defended that statute. So, and I think what we've seen from Pam Bondi as Florida Attorney General is she's going to be in that general mold. She's not somebody's going to be different from every other Attorney General in history. So I would expect her office to continue defending those statutes.
Right.
Well,
and I think you're right as far as like the most likely outcome here is that the government will continue to defend, the AG's office will continue to defend federal laws. I'm almost certain on that one. And the cases where an AG steps out and says, I won't defend the law, like when the California, it has happened.
It virtually never at the federal level. And occasionally at the state level, like the California Attorney General at one point refused to defend California's legal definition of marriage as one man and one woman. And that was, that was a big sensation when that happened. And it was seen by many as quite improper, regardless of what one's feelings are on that issue, which was unresolved at the time, legally speaking.
Sure.
But so the more intricate question is what happens if you're defending a federal statute and you lose. How far up do you have to appeal it? If you lose in the Fifth Circuit, do you have to ask the Supreme Court for certiorari? There's nothing more likely to get a grant of certiorari than a federal statute being held unconstitutional. But not every federal statute that is held unconstitutional in lower court gets a cert petition from the Solicitor General's office to the U.S. Supreme Court. Most do, but not every single one. So there will be some room for discretion in there. But remember, Pam Bondi, as Florida AG, defended the law that was enacted in 2013 that banned young adult Floridians from buying retail long guns.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll get into a little bit more about Pam Bondi
Okay.
and her background in a minute, but but this is the more, I guess, realistic path that you see. Potential changes, maybe how they argue the cases, how aggressive they are in appealing them up the chain, that sort of thing.
Well, sure, and there's the how you argue thing, and starting under the first term of President George W. Bush, Attorney General Ashcroft came out with a memo to the Department of Justice lawyers saying it is now the Department of Justice's position that the Second Amendment guarantees an individual right, which was great. But that didn't stop the Department of Justice from defending every federal gun law, including in criminal cases. So it did affect how they argued. They say, there's definitely an individual Second Amendment right, but this federal statute that bans a convicted violent felon from having a gun is consistent with the Second Amendment individual right.
Right. Okay. And like I said, there have been cases, even I think Barr at one point refused to defend a federal law. And I think there was actually just one just recently about firing minority members of agencies like the FTC or FCC, where they're not going to defend and if you're on the Attorney General side of that, you still have what's Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, and their state parallels, says you can't make bad faith arguments. You can't you can't do frivolous arguments. You can't do an argument that's contrary to precedent, unless you're also arguing that the precedent should be overturned and I'm just preserving this issue for appeal. So if there's really nothing you can legitimately say in defense of a statute, then the Attorney General might do that. But that's at the very extreme edge. Okay. But you can imagine statutes like, if a statute says 3 members of the Federal Communications Commission have to be black, that's plainly unconstitutional. And the Attorney General in that case would have to confess error and say, no, we can't defend this under existing precedent. Right. Okay. The next section here also has, I think, the potential to be significant. There's a lot of potential within this, although it's only a few words here that just talks about looking at agencies' classifications of firearms and ammunition, which maybe doesn't sound like there's a lot of space for maneuvering there, but with how some federal laws are written, there could be some significant action under that subhead, right?
Yeah, and there's always stuff going on in that. Although it's often, it's often not the kind of thing that comes up to broader consciousness, even among the gun owning public. But, for example, there's always issues on what is a machine gun under the National Firearms Act. And, constant issues is like, this thing was made in Austria in 1970. And when it was made, it was a machine gun, but it's been altered. So now it's a semi-auto only. You've had many times over the years of ATF saying, well, it's like original sin and there's no way to expiate it. It's still a machine gun. That happens. 18 U.S. Code 922R, enacted in the George H.W. Bush administration, says you cannot. The Bush administration had banned the import of a lot of semi-auto rifles under the claim that they're not used for sporting purposes.
Yeah, sporting purposes is a big exception in federal law, especially for imports, right?
It's a gigantic issue.
And a lot of discrepancy, a lot of subjective freedom there for the administration.
And so on the broad classification of sporting purposes, ATF has taken the position that sometimes, as in the Bush ban, that the only thing they really care about is hunting. So if this isn't a gun that's recommended by hunting guides, then it can't have sporting purposes. And, even back in the early days after the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Bureau took the position that plinking at tin cans which is, you know, probably one of the most common sporting activities of American gun owners in real life, that didn't count as a sporting purpose, because if because they wanted to outlaw inexpensive German and other foreign-made handguns, which are, you know, unquestionably used for plinking. So they had to say plinking doesn't count. So there's a lot of, you know, under current interpretations, you know, the fact that a gun is ideal for, say, a 3-gun competition, or IDPA, an International Defensive Pistol Association, those kinds of things, which are sports and have winners and losers and people who train really hard and all those things. That's still generally not counted as a sporting purpose for importability. But then on this 922R, it says we've got whatever it is, that we've got these guns that are banned from import by a federal regulation. 922 says, and we'll add on to that by saying you can't assemble one of those guns in the United States if it's made from foreign parts. And that's what the statute says. Then the regulation is, well, exactly how many foreign parts? You know, if the gun's got 87 parts and one foreign part, the one foreign part is the trigger spring, does that violate 922R or not? And ATF has a regulation on this, and that regulation could be changed to say, you know, no, we're really only, you know, it could be the number of foreign parts that qualify to be put on the bad list and become illegal could be narrowed.
Right. And that's something that maybe not your average gun buyers walking into a gun shop might care about, but it's definitely something that collectors have been are very well aware of.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So there's some of the things that could fall under that potentially. Not saying they will do these things, but this is the potential. Right. And then the last one is again another maybe potentially large, a little bit vague. The processing of applications to make, manufacture, transport, or export firearms. And one of the things I'm wondering there is, you know, does that implicate perhaps the Biden administration's changes to firearm export regulations, or are we just talking about things like processing times for NFA applications or stuff like? What do you make of it?
I think it includes both. Mm-hmm. And you know, the Biden administration, ATF, to its credit, there was an enormous backlog of applications on suppressors, and they worked through that and they got it done. And now my understanding is if you walk into the store and you want to buy a suppressor, you know, they'll ship the form, I guess, form 4 to ATF for you. And you may get an approval from ATF in 24 hours or maybe 72, but they've really cut that delay tremendously.
It used to be like 9 months or more.
Yeah. Well, it was, yeah, exactly. And it was an obvious barrier now. And now by doing that, they've made the statute more defensible in court, because there's a difference between a 1-day wait and a 9-month wait. But right. The point you made about farms, about exports is huge. And I am not an expert on this thing, but my understanding is they came in about a year ago with a extremely harsh rule that again was more in the nature of gun prevention rather than in the nature of reasonable regulation to keep guns out of the wrong hands.
Yeah. So they put a lot of further restrictions on exporting certain kinds of guns. What would often fall under the so-called assault weapon category. You know, semi-automatic centerfire rifles with certain features like the AR-15, and you know, made it harder to export those. And then ban them from export in certain countries, like including Israel and Ukraine, some of our allies. So, you know,
we wouldn't want to have them to have effective guns, which was the Biden administration policy on both of those countries. Is we're willing to help you defend yourself, but not we don't want you to go too far and actually try to win the war.
Yeah. Now these were civilian gun exports, so it's a little bit different than that. But yes, I take your point. So I guess that fleshes out what exactly could happen from this executive order. What what we might see at the end of this 30 days. But I guess the question then is, what do you think we're actually going to see? Because as we alluded to earlier here, Pam Bondi seems to have at least some sway in what exactly the administration is going to do on any of these areas. She's the one who's going to be reviewing, or at least her office is going to be reviewing this stuff and then coordinating with the White House Policy Office. But, and obviously one of the concerns about her from gun rights activists is her history, some of which you mentioned, in defending and advocating for certain gun restrictions, including age restrictions. Red flag laws was another area that people didn't like her activism after Parkland to help pass that law in Florida. And so there's a lot of skepticism over Pam Bondi. Now I don't think it's reached necessarily Republican congressmen and senators, because there was no opposition to her in confirmation. She didn't really even get questioned about this, but it does, raise the idea of how far do you think she would realistically be willing to go on this stuff? I mean, I don't know, the frames and receivers rule. Do we even know if Donald Trump is opposed to something like that, or Pam Bondi is opposed to that kind of regulation to begin with? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think her record is overall as a Republican who goes along with whatever the mainstream of the Republican Party thinks usually, and is not typically an envelope pusher. Trying to see how far we can go. Now, maybe on immigration, where she's got an extremely strong mandate from the president, and likewise on chemical castration of children and racial discrimination and things like that, she might be fairly aggressive, because that's clearly what the president wants, and those are all positions that are generally pretty popular with the American people as a whole. On the gun stuff, I think she's got to come back and give the White House some things to crow about and say, look what we did for you, gun owners. But if we had the folks on from Gun Owners of America, which defines itself as the group that's always going to take the most ultra position, I would say their list versus the Pam Bondi I did it list, there's going to be a large gap between those two things.
Yeah, I think that's probably.
But I think there'll be some significant things.
Yeah, I mean, I would be surprised, given the way they wrote this. I don't know. I have a couple thoughts on it. Right, if they were going to do all of these things, they could have just done them. Right. There's no real need for this 30-day review period. Or am I? Well, or am I being too?
Withdrawing a regulation, you can't just do that, and that's
you can't just do it, but you can say start doing it.
We can initiate it, but that's a kind of thing that's better initiated when you have the actual attorney general in office rather than the acting attorney general.
Yeah. Now, I guess my question on it is like,
and there's no confirmed ATF director yet, or even no one even nominated.
Right. They haven't. Are we sure they're going to nominate anyone is another thing too. He hadn't promised to do that. And he had an acting director for most of it, for the entirety of it. I mean, he did try to nominate somebody, but they failed. So I don't know if that's what's going to come down with that. But I guess my question is, we're just first off here, the 30-day thing. Do you view this review period as a legitimate, useful thing, or maybe just a way to delay a little bit before they decide what they want to do? Because these are all pretty well-known issues. They seem to know exactly what the gun rights advocates want them to do.
I think it's useful because you saw in Trump's first term, and including those first several months, he was like the dog that caught the fire truck and then didn't know what to do with it. And so a lot of things that his appointees did, at say EPA, they made decisions that I think were scientifically correct and beneficial, but they often then their decisions got overturned in the courts because they hadn't gone through the full and proper procedures.
Yeah.
So I think
they seem to be doing that again here. Some of these early, very aggressive actions are
on the personnel stuff that's true, and then we'll see how that turns out.
We'll see. Yeah, we don't
they're winning some of them. I mean, they're just
sure.
The I believe the First Circuit just upheld their buyout plan.
Or they said there was no standing for the employees. I think so. Yeah,
right. The union
that one's going forward.
Right, and then so these things there's a lot of room for clarification between a preliminary injunction motion on Thursday versus a Circuit Court of Appeals decision 2 weeks later. So, certainly. But on the regulatory front, with this kind of thing, I think it's okay to do.
You prefer this slower, more managed approach.
Yeah, and I think it's also better for the White House because to the extent they're trying to show civil rights advocates that we're doing something on this issue, it's better to come back with a package.
Okay.
To say, we rather than dribbling it out, is like, we fixed the thing that says if you sell your gun for a loss, but it's a nominal profit because of inflation, you need an FFL. Well, fine, but that's not going to be the top story of the day. It's not one of these like blockbuster thing like the protecting women's sports executive order, which just could stand on its own and be gigantic.
Okay, so you don't view the 30-day thing as the sort of difference in urgency or expediency with some of the way they've done some of this other stuff. You don't think that's concerning. In fact, you think it's perhaps the right way.
I think it's better. Yeah.
Okay.
Well begun is halfway done, as they say. So if they start it right, that gives them a better chance of success.
Okay. That's fair. And then, for me, I look at it and I see a list and I think, well, it would be pretty wild if they put out this list that covers pretty much everything that the gun rights movement wants from the executive branch in this term, and then don't do any of them. So that seems very unlikely, right?
Right.
But at the same time, it also makes me feel like delegating this to Bondi lets them not do necessarily everything.
Right.
Do you think that's fair too? So probably come down somewhere in the middle, maybe most of the big ticket stuff, these rules especially, rolling them back.
I'm cautiously optimistic.
Yeah. Okay.
But I guarantee you that the gun ban groups, even if she does very little and disappoints the pro-civil rights people, they will all go into complete performative hysterics because that's part of their fundraising model. And
and that's become a hallmark of our politics these days. The extreme I mean, I saw RFK Jr. is getting confirmed, and Giffords was put out a tweet very upset about that. Even though RFK Jr. is probably not somebody that a lot of gun rights activists are very happy with, given that he labeled the NRA a terror organization. So, and was until very recently for all sorts of new gun restrictions, including an assault weapons ban and so forth. But that's sort of the nature of our politics now, because he's, a Trump official. There's a lot of knee jerk reaction both directions.
Yeah, he's not going to sneak it'll be interesting to see from him, because the gun issue, I think his view of that was when he was running for president this time was
Trump.
It wasn't what Kennedy was, that Kennedy was not that interested in it, that he was much more concerned, with his things like, nutrition and foreign wars and all that kind of stuff. And then and to the extent he had to take positions on gun issues, he would, but he really didn't. He'd would have preferred to run a campaign where that wasn't a topic one way or the other.
Perhaps. And I think he did reverse himself later on in the campaign, or at least when he endorsed Trump, I believe. But regardless, that's a whole nother topic. RFK and some of the potential obviously he's running HHS, which does have some potential realm in gun policy. Certainly the gun control advocates have pushed for gun violence to be treated as an epidemic.
And to try to issue guidelines on physicians requiring them to interrogate patients about gun ownership
Sure.
and things like that.
So we'll see if RFK goes down that path or what not. Obviously, I think most people are more focused on the other areas of him and
I think he'll
health policy.
stay. I
but-
think he'll stay as far away from it as he can.
Well, either way, we'll certainly keep an eye on that, but that's for a whole nother episode, certainly. So if people want to follow your writing and follow what you do, where can they do that?
My website is davekopel.org, DAVEKOPEL.org, and I'm on Twitter at Dave Kopel, DAVEKOPEL.
All right, wonderful. Well, we appreciate you joining again here and giving us your insight into the potential for this executive order, what could happen, and perhaps what might actually come out of it. As much as we can speculate on, at least. And we'll have to have you back on in the future as well.
We'll find out what happened.
Yes. We'll see what actually comes out of it, and then maybe we'll have you back on to discuss the details of that.
All right, sounds good.
All right, I'm going to hand it off to myself to tell you guys a little bit about the Dispatch, which is back sponsoring once again this week. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch, and so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news, and it's focused on it, and I think it's fantastic. But they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.